The door of the grocery store slid shut behind him with a soft mechanical sigh, and Soren flinched like it had slammed. Cold air bit through his hoodie as soon as he stepped into the parking lot. The kind of cold that went straight for bone, not skin. He paused. Not because he wanted to, but because his body demanded it. A slow inhale through his nose, a careful exhale through parted lips. He counted without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. The pressure low in his abdomen tightened again, sharp enough to blur the edges of his vision. He reached his car and leaned his weight against the rusted door, pretending he was only tired, pretending there wasn't a rhythm to the pain, pretending the bulge beneath his zipped hoodie wasn't pulling his center of gravity forward like an anchor. 9 months had taught him how to look normal. One hand stayed braced on the metal, the other settled instinctively over his stomach, fingers spread, protective. As if that would be enough if something went wrong, as if the world hadn't already proven it could take what it wanted without asking. A laugh carried across the lot, male, low, familiar in the way a scar aches before rain. Soren's breath stuttered. He told himself not to turn around, told himself Chicago was big, that coincidence happened, that fear made ghosts out of strangers. His heart didn't listen. It began to hammer, loud enough he was sure someone could hear it. Footsteps approached, unhurried, confident, wrong. He straightened too quickly and paid for it. Pain lanced up his spine. He swallowed it down, nodded once to no one, and reached for his keys with fingers that wouldn't quite stop shaking. Hey! The voice came from too close. Not loud, not threatening, worse, controlled. Soren froze. That was how he'd always survived, by stillness, by becoming small enough that attention slid past him instead of landing. He didn't answer. He focused on breathing, on not showing weakness, on the weight beneath his hoodie that made that impossible. Another figure moved into his peripheral vision, positioning himself between Soren and the flow of cars cutting through the lot, not touching him, not crowding him, just there, a wall where there hadn't been one a second before. Protection, offered before it was asked for. Soren's throat tightened. I didn't mean to startle you, the man said. His eyes were sharp, assessing, already cataloging details Soren had spent months hiding. The way his stance favored one hip, the way his hand never left his stomach, the faint sheen of sweat at his temple despite the cold. Soren forced his lips into something that might pass for a polite smile. It's fine. I just... tired. An apology slipped out automatically, unearned. Sorry. The word tasted like habit. A third presence joined them, completing a quiet triangle around him. No raised voices, no confrontation, just gravity shifting, pulling Soren back into an orbit he'd barely escaped. The men didn't look like monsters. That was the worst part. They looked like power dressed as normalcy, clean coats, expensive watches, faces the world trusted without question. One of them glanced down and paused. His gaze caught on Soren's wrist. The hospital band was white, creased from days of wear he hadn't thought to replace. It peeked out where his sleeve had ridden up. A small thing. A fatal thing. The man's expression changed. Not shock. Recognition. Soren's hand dropped instinctively, tugging the sleeve down too late. His heart began to race in earnest now, each beat a warning bell. It's nothing, he said quickly, the words tumbling over each other. Just routine. I should go. He fumbled with his keys, dropped them. The sound of metal hitting asphalt echoed too loudly in the sudden silence. No one moved to help him pick them up. That hurt more than if they had. A car horn blared somewhere behind them. The man standing between Soren and the street shifted subtly, blocking the sound, blocking everything. The world narrowed to the space between them. You don't look fine, he said. Soren laughed once, breathless. People say that a lot. He bent carefully, pain flaring, and retrieved his keys. His vision swam. He focused on the dent in his car door, on the peeling paint, on anything except the way their eyes tracked his every movement. The second man spoke, softer. You're shaking. I'm cold. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. The third hadn't said a word yet. He was watching Soren the way someone watched a door they expected to be kicked in. Ready, waiting. Soren's mind raced, cataloging exits that didn't exist. He could get in the car, he could lock the doors, he could drive, if the pain didn't spike, if his hands cooperated, if they let him, if. A familiar scent drifted closer, clean, expensive, impossible to forget. It twisted something deep in his chest, something he'd buried under months of fear and exhaustion. Belonging. Once. Long ago. On terms he hadn't understood. The man with the wristband recognition took a step closer. Not aggressive. Curious. "When's your due date?" he asked. The question hit like a blow. Soren's mouth opened, closed. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't planned for seeing them ever again, let alone like this. Exposed, heavy, cornered by a life he was supposed to have erased. He backed into the car door, metal pressed cold against his spine. "That's not—" His voice cracked. He swallowed hard and tried again, quieter. "That's not your concern." The silence stretched. Somewhere in the distance, a cart rattled. A door opened and closed. The world went on, indifferent. The man between him and the street glanced at the others, then back at Soren. "You look like you're about to fall," he said. "Sit down." It sounded like an order softened into concern. "I'm fine," Soren repeated, because refusing help was safer than accepting the wrong kind. His hand tightened over his stomach as another wave of pain rolled through him. He breathed through it, jaw clenched, determined not to make a sound. The quiet one finally spoke. His voice was low, steady. "Is there someone with you?" The question was a blade wrapped in velvet. Soren shook his head before he could stop himself, then immediately regretted it. Alone, unprotected, confirmed. The man with the wristband took another step closer, eyes narrowing as he studied Soren's face, the shadows beneath his eyes, the weight he'd lost everywhere except where it mattered. "Have you been seeing a doctor regularly?" he asked. Too many questions, too much attention, too late. Soren's pulse roared in his ears. He looked at their faces, at the concern trying to pass for neutrality, at the authority they carried without effort, and something inside him cracked. They didn't get to care now. He leaned forward slightly, just enough to whisper, his voice barely audible over the rush of blood in his ears. "They can't know about the baby." The words slipped out like a confession he'd never meant to make. All three men went still, and if you felt that moment tighten in your chest, if you felt the danger in the quiet, the way safety offered too late can be worse than none at all, stay with this story. Because what happens next will test whether survival is enough, or whether truth always demands its price. The cold followed him even after the parking lot disappeared behind his eyes. Soren lay awake that night, listening to the radiator knock in uneven bursts, each clang too loud in the silence of his apartment. His hand rested on his stomach out of instinct now, not comfort. The baby shifted, slow and heavy, and he breathed through the movement the way he always did, quietly, carefully, like noise itself was a risk. Belonging had once felt like this, temporary, conditional, easily taken away. The grocery store lights, the smell of oil-stained asphalt, the sound of a voice saying, "Hey," they kept looping back, dragging memories with them. He tried to push them down, but exhaustion loosened the grip he normally kept on the past, and the past came anyway. He hadn't entered their world through romance. There were no soft promises, no flowers, no moment where someone chose him because they wanted him. There had been a hallway, a long one, too white, too quiet. He remembered sitting in a plastic chair with his hands folded in his lap, knees drawn together, apologizing to a receptionist who hadn't even looked at him. He'd been 20, thin, careful, already trained by foster homes and closed doors to wait without asking for anything. They'd been watching him then, too. He just hadn't known it. When the offer came, it was framed as opportunity, stability, protection, a place to stand that wouldn't disappear overnight. No one used the word omega. They didn't have to. The role was understood the moment he accepted, absorb tension, soften edges, take blame before it reached them. He was good at it, too good. Calder had been the first to speak to him directly, not kindly, not cruelly, just with certainty. "You'll have structure here," he'd said, sliding a folder across the table without looking up. "Rules, expectations, follow them and you'll be safe." Safe. Soren had nodded immediately, relief washing through him so fast it almost hurt. He'd signed without reading everything. He'd thanked Calder twice. Bricks came later, always later. He never gave instructions, only presence. He stood too close during meetings, shoulders angled subtly toward Soren, eyes tracking every raised voice in the room. Protection that didn't ask permission. Once, when a deal went sideways and a man slammed his fist on the table, Bricks had moved before Soren could flinch. Just a step, just enough. Afterward, Soren had whispered, "You didn't have to." Bricks had looked at him like the answer was obvious. "Yes, I did." That had felt like care. Nolan was different. Nolan never intervened. He never raised his voice. He noticed everything. He'd sit in the corner, hands folded, eyes steady. When Soren spoke, Nolan listened the way people listen to weather reports, quietly, intently, deciding how to prepare. He never thanked Soren for smoothing conflicts, for taking hits meant for others. But he remembered. Once, after a long night, Nolan had set a glass of water beside Soren without comment. Another time, he'd turned off a lamp that was shining too brightly in Soren's eyes. Silence as intimacy. Soren had mistaken that for safety too. The problem with conditional belonging is that it feels like love when you've never had either. Soren learned quickly what made things easier for them. He apologized before anyone accused him. He offered solutions that cost him comfort instead of profit. He smiled when deals ended badly and nodded when someone needed a scapegoat. It became automatic. "You don't have to take responsibility for that," someone said once, almost surprised. Soren laughed softly. "It's okay. I don't mind." That was the lie he told most often. Because he did mind. He just didn't think his discomfort mattered enough to protect. The first time he felt something was wrong, it wasn't dramatic. It was a meeting where no one introduced him. He stood by the wall, folder in hand, listening as Calder outlined a strategy Soren had helped design. Bricks watched the room. Nolan said nothing. No one looked at Soren when the praise came. It shouldn't have hurt. It did. Later, when Soren mentioned it carefully, apologetically, Calder frowned. "You're reading into it." Bricks changed the subject. Nolan met Soren's eyes for half a second longer than usual, then looked away. That was when Soren learned the most dangerous rule of belonging. If you need reassurance, you've already asked for too much. The grocery store parking lot had proven something he'd tried not to think about. They hadn't followed him the night he disappeared. He remembered that night now with brutal clarity. The way his hands shook as he packed, the way his phone stayed silent, the way he kept expecting footsteps, a voice, anything. Nothing came, not until months later. Not until he was visibly pregnant. Not until it was too late to pretend he was still useful. The realization sat heavy in his chest as he stared at the ceiling. He had been safe only as long as he was necessary. The baby shifted again, stronger this time. Soren winced, then softened, rubbing slow circles over stretched skin. "I know," he whispered, the words meant for no one else. "I know." He wondered what would have happened if he'd stayed, if he'd told them sooner, if he'd asked, really asked, for help instead of assuming it had limits. The thought made his throat tighten, because part of him already knew the answer. Morning came gray and thin. Soren dressed slowly, pausing often, listening to his body the way he'd learned to listen to rooms. He made tea he didn't finish. He checked his phone too many times. No messages. That should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like confirmation. As he stepped out into the hallway, keys in hand, one thought followed him with quiet, aching clarity. He had normalized control because it came wrapped in safety. And safety, he was learning, could disappear the moment it became inconvenient. If that realization hurt you, if you felt the slow dread of recognizing yourself in the way Soren stayed quiet to survive, don't look away yet. What comes next will force him to confront the truth he's been avoiding, and it won't be gentle. The first sign something was wrong wasn't nausea. It was silence. Soren sat on the edge of his bed with a pregnancy test balanced on his knee, staring at the bathroom door like it might open on its own and tell him what he already suspected. The radiator wasn't knocking that morning. The city outside felt muted. Even his phone, usually buzzing with reminders, alarms, borrowed urgency, was quiet. He'd learned to distrust quiet. When the result appeared, clear and undeniable, his breath left him in a rush. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He pressed his palm flat to his stomach, grounding himself, and waited for panic to arrive. It came late. Slow. Calculated. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not to him. Not in a world where every part of his life had been structured to avoid surprises. He counted again. Weeks. Months. His chest tightened as timelines aligned too easily, too cleanly. He thought of Calder's rules, Brix's watchful presence, Nolan's silence, and then he thought of the night he'd left. Soren stood up too fast. The room tilted. He grabbed the dresser and breathed until the edges sharpened again. "I can handle this," he said aloud, testing the words. They sounded thin. The man who offered help didn't look dangerous. That should have been the warning. Marwick Rell had a calm smile and expensive shoes. He spoke softly, listened patiently, and never interrupted. When Soren explained, carefully, vaguely, why he needed advice, Marwick nodded like everything made sense. "You've been under a lot of pressure," he said. "Anyone would panic." Soren apologized out of reflex. "I didn't mean to." Marwick lifted a hand gently. "You don't need to explain yourself here." Relief flooded Soren so fast it made his eyes sting. They sat across from each other in a neutral office that smelled faintly of citrus cleaner. No windows, no clocks, just paperwork and reassurance. "There are ways to manage situations like this," Marwick continued. "Discretion matters. Timing matters. You need to think about what's safest for everyone involved." "For the baby," Soren said quickly. Marwick smiled. "Of course." "He didn't say your baby." Soren didn't notice that omission until much later. The warning came wrapped as concern. "If they find out," Marwick said one afternoon, folding his hands neatly, "they'll want control. That's not cruelty. It's how they operate. Assets, liabilities. You know this." Soren's stomach twisted. "They wouldn't hurt a child." Marwick's smile didn't change. "No. They would manage the situation." The words settled heavily between them. "What does that mean?" Soren asked. "It means," Marwick said gently, "that you may not remain the primary decision-maker." Soren felt cold spread through him, deeper than fear. He pressed a hand to his stomach, feeling the faint flutter beneath his skin. "I won't let them take my baby." Marwick nodded, as if impressed. "Then you need distance. Now. Quietly." Soren didn't confront them. That was the part he regretted most on sleepless nights, the absence of noise. No argument, no accusations, no chance for them to stop him. He packed while the city slept. Clothes first, documents second, the essentials he'd learned to identify over years of instability. He paused at the door more than once, listening for footsteps that never came. His phone stayed dark. By dawn, he was gone. No one followed. Silence, again, louder than violence. Running was less dramatic than people imagined. It was paperwork, fake smiles, cheap apartments with thin walls, sleeping in his car when rent outpaced wages, learning which gas stations were safe to rest in and which weren't. The pregnancy progressed without permission. His body changed faster than his circumstances. Nausea gave way to aches, aches to sharp, breath-stealing pain. He worked anyway, took under-the-table jobs in warehouses where no one asked questions as long as he didn't slow down. One afternoon, while clocking in, he noticed the logo on the wall, a subsidiary. The name hit him like a punch to the ribs. Soren stared at it until his vision blurred, then forced himself to look away. He said nothing, did his job, kept his head down. Irony, he thought bitterly, had a sense of humor. The nights were the hardest. Curled in the back seat of his car, knees drawn up as much as his body allowed, Soren learned how to cry without sound. He learned how to breathe through contractions that came too early and too often, fear sharpening every sensation. "If they find me," he whispered once, forehead pressed to the steering wheel, "please don't let them take you." The baby kicked, solid and real, and Soren held on to that proof like a promise. Months passed in fragments, a borrowed room, a used crib, a clinic that accepted cash and didn't ask for family history. The medical wristband he forgot to remove after one long appointment. Every day was a calculation. How visible am I? How safe is this? What do I give up today to make it to tomorrow? Fear aged him faster than time ever could. When the parking lot happened, when familiar voices found him anyway, Soren understood something with sudden clarity. Running had never been about escape. It had been about delaying the inevitable. And now, standing on cracked asphalt with his back against a rusted car, he felt the truth closing in. Because Marwick's final warning echoed in his mind, as clear and devastating as the day it was spoken. If they find you, he had said softly, the child won't stay yours. And if that sentence lodged somewhere deep in your chest, if you felt the terror of loving something in a world that treats love like leverage, don't stop listening now. The past has finally caught up, and it's bringing answers no one is ready for. The parking lot didn't erupt the way Soren had always imagined it would. No shouting, no hands grabbing his arms, no sudden violence that would justify the fear living under his skin. It stayed quiet. That was worse. Cars rolled past the entrance in slow, indifferent lines. A shopping cart rattled somewhere behind them. Cold air crept up from the asphalt and settled into Soren's bones as if it intended to stay. The three men stood where they were, spaced just enough to make leaving feel rude instead of impossible. Soren hated that detail most of all. They were thinking. He could feel it. Calder's gaze kept drifting, subtle, controlled, between Soren's face and the curve his hoodie could no longer fully hide. Not staring, measuring, running timelines. Bricks watched the environment instead. Cars, doors, reflections in windows. His body angled just enough to shield Soren from the street, like he'd done 100 times before. Muscle memory, not intention. Nolan didn't look at Soren's stomach at all. He looked at his eyes. That was how Soren knew this wasn't going to end quickly. You shouldn't be standing, Brick said at last. Not a question, not a command, just a fact delivered calmly. I'm fine, Soren replied, because it was easier than explaining that sitting made it harder to leave. Calder exhaled slowly through his nose. We're not here to cause a scene. Soren almost laughed. He pressed his back more firmly against the car, grounding himself in the cold metal. Then what are you here for? The question hung between them. Nolan answered. We didn't expect to see you. There it was. Not we looked for you. Not why did you leave. Expectation, assumption, entitlement. Soren nodded once, as if that settled something. Neither did I. For a moment, something like uncertainty flickered across Calder's face. It vanished quickly, replaced by that familiar composure Soren had once mistaken for reliability. You disappeared, Calder said. No explanation. Soren's fingers curled into his sleeve. I didn't think I was required to give one. Silence stretched again. Bricks shifted his weight. You could have reached out. Soren's throat tightened. I did. They all looked at him then. Not after, Soren clarified softly. Before. The words landed heavier than accusation ever could. Nolan broke eye contact first. That was new. We should talk somewhere warmer, Calder said, defaulting to logistics when emotion threatened to surface. You look. Don't, Soren cut in. His voice shook, and he hated that it did. Don't finish that sentence. Calder stopped, a small victory, an exhausting one. I'm not coming with you, Soren said. I have an appointment. A lie? But one they couldn't disprove without crossing a line. Bricks frowned. You're in pain. I'm pregnant, Soren replied flatly. That happens. The word changed the air. Pregnant, not implied, not hidden, spoken aloud, finally. Calder's jaw tightened. Nolan's expression went carefully blank. Bricks took half a step forward, then stopped himself, hands flexing at his sides. How far along? Calder asked. Soren didn't answer. Nolan studied his face again, slower this time. You're close. It wasn't a question either. Soren felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with his body. He wrapped his arms around himself, instinctive, futile. This isn't a conversation we're having, he said. Not here. Bricks glanced toward the store entrance. Someone's watching. Soren followed his gaze. That was when he saw him. Marwick Rell stood just beyond the sliding doors, hands in his coat pockets, posture relaxed, like he'd been there all along, like he'd expected this exact configuration of people to form. Their eyes met. Marwick smiled. It was the same smile Soren remembered from the office, polite, understanding, poisonously calm. Well, Marwick said as he approached, voice carrying just enough to be heard, this is a surprise. Soren's stomach dropped. Calder's head snapped up. What are you doing here? Marwick laughed lightly. Shopping, like everyone else. His gaze flicked to Soren's stomach, then back up. Congratulations, by the way. Soren's hands trembled. Bricks moved without thinking, stepping slightly in front of Soren this time, not touching him, not claiming him, just blocking Marwick's line of sight. Marwick noticed. His smile widened. You didn't tell them, he said to Soren, sounding almost amused. Did you? Soren didn't respond. Nolan's voice was quiet. Tell us what? Marwick clasped his hands together, delighted. Oh, so much! Soren's chest tightened, breath coming shallow and fast. He knew this feeling, the moment just before the floor dropped out from under him. You shouldn't be here, Soren said hoarsely. Marwick leaned closer, lowering his voice. You shouldn't have survived this long. The words sliced cleanly through the air. And if your chest tightened right there, if you felt the danger sharpen, the sense that something carefully buried is about to be dragged into the light, stay with this story. Because what Marwick knows will fracture everything, and Soren won't be able to outrun the truth this time. The words didn't land all at once. They unfolded slowly, like a knife twisting deeper with every revelation. Marwick leaned against the side of Soren's car, hands folded neatly, smile still polite. Calder, Bricks, and Nolan flanked him, each processing the information in silence, each hiding a storm behind practiced control. You were never meant to survive this long, Marwick said again, softer this time. It was never about you, never about the baby. It was about consolidating power. That's all. Soren's stomach tightened, and he instinctively placed a hand over it. The baby moved, slow and steady, a heartbeat of innocence in the chaos around them. He swallowed hard, trying to keep the tremor from his voice. I don't understand. You will, Marwick said, stepping closer. All of you. He spread the story out in pieces. Years ago, a threat had been fabricated. Soren had been a pawn, a symbol of loyalty and expendability. The triplets hadn't abandoned him. They had been played, manipulated, blinded by Marwick's careful orchestration. Every decision they thought they'd made independently was already predetermined. Calder's hands clenched at his sides. Bricks's jaw tightened. Nolan's eyes, usually unreadable, flickered with something that looked like shock, brief, sharp, and uncomfortable. They all had been actors in a play, whose script had been written without their consent. Soren remained silent. He let the words wash over him like a cold tide. No anger, no accusation, just the weight of truth settling into the hollow left by years of fear. That calm hurt more than screams ever could. Marwick leaned back, letting the pause stretch. And the child? Well, that's a little more complicated. Soren's hand dropped from his stomach. He braced against the car, knees locking slightly, ready to flee, but knowing he couldn't. It was all three of you, Marwick said, letting the words hang. A covert agreement. Fertility tests, legal filings you'd forgotten, biologically tied to all three. You weren't replaced. You were shared. The air seemed to shift. Calder blinked first, then Bricks, then Nolan. Their expressions changed in microseconds, a mixture of disbelief, guilt, and horror. Soren stared at them, unblinking, as if to etch the moment into memory. He didn't speak. His silence was louder than any accusation. It was a verdict. Brick stepped forward, then stopped. Calder opened his mouth, then closed it again. Nolan's hands flexed at his sides, then relaxed. None of them knew what to say. Soren finally exhaled, a long, careful breath. You weren't supposed to be playing with people, he said softly, and I wasn't supposed to matter to you at all. Marwick's lips twitched. And yet... Soren shook his head. Enough. That's enough. He wanted to walk away. He wanted to disappear again. But something rooted him to the asphalt. Something that told him he needed to see the truth in their eyes before he moved on. Calder swallowed. His voice, when it came, was strained. We didn't know. Soren's gaze sharpened. No, you didn't, but you didn't ask either. Marwick's smile widened. Well, now you know everything. The rest is up to you. The child moved again, stronger this time, as if sensing the tension, as if demanding presence in a world too complicated for innocence to survive unscathed. Soren's fingers rested lightly on his stomach. You survived, Marwick said, stepping back finally, giving space. But survival was never the goal of any of this. Soren didn't respond. Survival had been his only goal, and he had achieved it. Alone. Calder looked at him, voice low, heavy. How did you make it this far? Soren's lips pressed into a thin line. By not relying on anyone who didn't choose to protect me. Brix's eyes narrowed, guilt flashing in them. Nolan's jaw tightened. None of them had expected this. The calm, collected, emotionally distant Soren standing before them, unbroken, having endured months they had thought would break him. The weight of what Marwick had revealed was enormous. Truths that had been withheld, manipulation that had spanned years, the reality of the child. And yet, Soren's presence, his quiet strength, made them feel powerless in a way they had never experienced before. A car door slammed somewhere behind them, jarring, and Soren flinched, hand instinctively protecting the baby. Calder stepped closer, not too close, and the protective energy between them was subtle, careful. Not touching, not claiming, just presence, awareness. Safety offered too late, but offered nonetheless. Soren's voice broke the tension, quiet, almost a whisper. It was all three of you. The words landed in the lot like stones dropped into a still pond. Ripples spread across faces, across pride, across power. And for the first time, Soren saw them, not as rulers of an empire, not as men who had once been gods in his world, but as flawed, human, late to the lesson that safety is only meaningful when it's timely. The air hung thick with possibilities. Marwick's smile faltered. Calder's hands twitched. Brix shifted his weight. Nolan's eyes never left Soren's. The baby kicked again, impatient, insisting that attention be paid. Soren's hand stayed where it belonged. I survived, he said quietly, and in that statement was a weight no one else could lift. They realized finally that information had become the weapon. Truth had flipped the game, and Soren had already won by simply enduring. If you felt that quiet tension, the slow realization that control and power can be dismantled with patience, stay with this story. Because the moment of reckoning is only beginning, and what comes next will challenge everyone's understanding of responsibility, regret, and the cost of truth. The hospital hallway smelled like antiseptic and something faintly metallic, the kind of scent that made Soren's stomach turn, even when nothing was wrong. Tonight, something was wrong. The monitors behind the sliding doors clicked in uneven rhythms. A nurse had hurried past him without meeting his eyes. Another had murmured words he couldn't quite catch. Heart rate, pressure, stay with me. And suddenly, the room felt too small to hold the fear rising in his chest. Soren sat on the edge of a narrow bed, hands folded over his stomach, posture rigid. He had learned how to make himself still in moments like this, how to disappear into quiet, how to let the world move around him without letting it see how much he was breaking. The baby moved restlessly beneath his palms. I'm here, he whispered. I'm not going anywhere. Across the room, Calder stood with his back to the wall, jaw clenched, eyes tracking every flicker of light on the machines. Brix paced in short, controlled steps, stopping only when a nurse brushed past him. Nolan leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, gaze fixed on Soren like he was trying to memorize him. None of them knew where they belonged in this space. That, Soren realized, was the point. The doctor's voice was calm when she explained the complications: stress, elevated blood pressure, signs of fetal distress that could not be ignored. Calder nodded like he was in a boardroom. Brix asked too many questions too quickly. Nolan said nothing at all. Soren listened quietly, absorbing each word without reaction. Fear had a way of hollowing him out until there was nothing left to panic with. Do you have a support person? The doctor asked, looking at him kindly. Soren hesitated. I'm fine, he said automatically. I'm here, Brix said at the same time. Calder opened his mouth. Nolan shifted. The doctor glanced between them, clearly uncertain. One person, she clarified. Soren closed his eyes. No one, he said. The word landed heavier than rejection. It wasn't anger that filled the room. It was something worse. Regret. When the contractions intensified, Soren barely made a sound. He gripped the sheets, knuckles white, breathing through the pain with the precision of someone who had practiced suffering in silence for a long time. Calder stood frozen, unable to reconcile the sight of him like this with the man he thought he knew. Brix's pacing turned frantic, helpless. Nolan's gaze never wavered, eyes dark with something he couldn't name. "This is my fault," Calder muttered under his breath. Soren heard him. He didn't respond. That hurt more. Hours blurred into something shapeless. Nurses came and went. Machines beeped. The baby's heart rate spiked and dipped in worrying patterns. Soren felt the moment his body began to falter. He started, then stopped himself. Asking felt dangerous. Vulnerability had always come with consequences. Nolan stepped forward before he could change his mind. "What do you need?" Soren looked at him, really looked. "Space," he said quietly. "Just space." Nolan nodded and moved, gently guiding Calder and Brix back. Not out of the room, just far enough that Soren could breathe without feeling surrounded. It was the smallest kindness. It came far too late. When the baby went into distress, everything changed. Alarms sounded, voices rose, hands touched Soren without asking, moving him, preparing him, managing the emergency with efficient urgency. Calder was ushered into the hallway, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles went pale. Brix sank down the stairwell steps, head in his hands, a low sound of panic escaping him. Nolan stood frozen just outside the door, watching the chaos with eyes that had never looked more powerless. Inside, Soren closed his eyes. "I'm still here," he whispered to his child, voice trembling now despite his efforts. "You're not alone." He didn't know if anyone else heard him. Later, how much later he wasn't sure, the noise faded, the room settled into a fragile calm. The baby was stable for now. Soren lay back against the pillows, exhausted beyond words, something in him quietly breaking. Calder came back first. He stood at the foot of the bed, unable to meet Soren's eyes. "I should have protected you," he said. Soren turned his head slightly, gaze unfocused. "That would have been easier months ago." Brix hovered near the doorway. "We can still—" Soren shook his head. "No." The single word carried finality. Nolan stepped closer. "What do you want from us?" Soren considered the question for a long moment. "Nothing," he said. "That's the point." The silence that followed was heavier than any accusation. Soren closed his eyes. "I survived," he whispered. "That's all." And if that sentence made something ache inside you, if you felt the weight of endurance mistaken for forgiveness, stay with this story. Because what comes next will force every character to confront whether regret can ever truly make things right. The city woke up to headlines before Soren even opened his eyes. He didn't see them. He didn't need to. He felt the shift. The hospital room was quieter than it had been the night before. Not peaceful, just waiting, like the air itself was holding its breath. The baby slept in a clear bassinet beside his bed, tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm that was finally steady. Soren watched that small movement with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Outside this room, something was breaking. Inside it, something fragile was being protected. Calder didn't come in right away. When he finally did, he looked different. Not physically, he was still immaculate, still controlled, but the weight behind his eyes had changed. Like someone had taken a ledger and erased a future he'd always assumed was guaranteed. "They're arresting Marwick," he said quietly. Soren didn't react. He kept his gaze on the baby. Brix followed him in, a step behind, voice tight. Not just him, his entire network, accounts frozen, deals exposed, the works. Soren nodded once. Good. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't gratitude. It was justice catching up to a lie. Nolan stood near the window, watching the city instead of Soren. "He used your silence," he said. "Ours too." Soren finally looked up. "That's how systems work. They reward people who don't make noise." The words weren't angry. They were tired. Calder swallowed. "We're dismantling everything he built, every shell company, every off-book agreement, even if it costs us—" "Status," Soren finished for him. "Power, reputation." Calder nodded. "Yes." That was what mattered. Not revenge, not apologies, loss, real, irreversible loss. Brix stepped forward hesitantly. "We can make sure you and the baby are protected." Accounts, property, anything you need. Soren studied him for a long moment. You don't get to buy safety after selling it. Brix flinched like he'd been struck. Calder opened his mouth, closed it again. Nolan's voice was low. Then what do you want? Soren glanced down at the baby, then back at them. I want you to stop. Stop what? Calder asked. Trying to fix this with power, Soren said. I don't belong to your world anymore. The words weren't cruel, they were boundaries. Later that day, news screens in the waiting area played footage of Marwick being escorted through a courthouse, face blank, smile finally gone. Commentators spoke about corruption, betrayal, a fall from grace that would ripple through industries. Soren didn't watch. He held his child instead. Calder returned in the evening alone. I've signed away controlling interests, he said, voice steady despite the weight of what he was saying. In companies tied to anything Marwick touched. There will be investigations. It will take years to rebuild, if it ever happens. Soren nodded. That was the right thing. Calder looked at him with something close to desperation. Does it change anything? Soren met his gaze. No. The truth hurt both of them. When Soren was discharged, he didn't let them walk him out. He packed his things slowly, carefully, one hand always on the baby. Brix waited in the hall. Nolan lingered by the door. Calder stood back, respecting the distance Soren had carved out with his silence. I'm leaving, Soren said simply. Calder nodded. We know. You don't get to follow. Another nod, harder this time. Soren stepped past them, through the corridor, into a future that was uncertain but his. At the hospital doors, he paused, not because he wanted to go back, but because part of him still remembered what it felt like to belong. Then he kept walking. And if you felt that ache, the moment where justice arrives, but love still doesn't, hold on, because healing doesn't look like reunion, and the hardest choices are still ahead. 3 months passed like a quiet negotiation with the future. Soren moved into a small apartment on the north side of the city, the kind of place that smelled faintly of paint and new beginnings. He kept the windows open even when it was cold. Light mattered now. Silence mattered too, but not the dangerous kind that swallowed you whole. This was the kind that let you hear your own breathing again. The baby, his baby, slept in a bassinet by the window, tiny fists curled like they were already holding on to something important. Soren learned the rhythm of feedings, the language of soft cries, the way exhaustion could make even the strongest resolve feel thin. Therapy became part of his routine. Not because it fixed anything quickly, but because it taught him how to sit with the damage without apologizing for it. He spoke about fear, about control, about the way love had once been given to him with conditions attached. Healing, he discovered, was uneven. Some days he felt strong. Some days he barely made it out of bed. Both counted. The triplets did not come together. Calder sent a message first. Not an apology, not a request, just a note. I'm here if you ever need anything. Soren didn't reply. Brix left a small package with the doorman one afternoon. Inside was a soft blanket and a handwritten card that said only, for when it gets cold. Soren kept the blanket. He threw away the card. Nolan waited the longest. When he finally wrote, it was a single sentence. I won't ask for what you're not ready to give. That, more than anything, made Soren pause. Life settled into a careful pattern. Morning light, coffee he never finished. The baby's quiet breathing. Walks through a park where no one knew his name. He learned to enjoy anonymity, to let strangers see him only as a tired parent, not as someone with a past that could still hurt him. Safety, he realized, wasn't dramatic. It was boring. And that was exactly what made it precious. The message came on a rainy afternoon. May we visit? No signatures. No pressure. Soren stared at the screen for a long time. He thought about the hospital, the parking lot, the way Brix had stood between him and danger without asking, the way Calder had lost everything too late, the way Nolan had seen him even when he didn't know how to protect him. He looked down at the baby, now wide-eyed and curious about the world. They're asking for nothing, Soren murmured. The baby blinked. Soren typed back slowly, one at a time. And if you felt that hesitation, the careful opening of a door that might still lead to pain, stay with this story. Because what comes next won't be loud or dramatic, but it will decide everything. The first steps didn't happen the way people imagine them. There was no warning, no camera ready, no careful build-up. Soren was on the floor, back against the couch, half awake and holding a mug of coffee that had gone cold when the baby, no longer a baby now, but something sturdier and brighter, let go of the table and took two uncertain steps toward him. Soren's breath caught. He didn't move, didn't speak. He knew better than to interrupt a fragile miracle. The child wobbled, paused, then collapsed into Soren's lap with a soft, surprised sound. And just like that, something irreversible happened. Soren laughed. It came out rough and startled, like a sound he hadn't used in a long time. He pulled the child close, forehead resting gently against warm hair. "You did it," he whispered. "You really did." Sunlight spilled through the open windows, painting everything in gold. The apartment was quiet in the way that meant peace, not danger. This was safety. Fragile, earned, his. Calder came first. He stood in the doorway like someone who knew he had no right to step inside without permission. His suit was gone. So was the armor he used to wear with it. Soren nodded once. Calder knelt instead of sitting, making himself smaller. He didn't reach for the child, he just watched. "I didn't come to ask for anything," he said. Soren believed him. Brix arrived a week later. He brought no gifts, just himself. He stayed by the wall, hands folded, eyes never leaving Soren or the child. "You don't owe us," Brix said quietly. "I know that." Nolan was last. He stood beside Soren on the balcony, both of them watching the city stretch out beneath them. "I'm still learning," Nolan said, voice low. "How to be someone who doesn't confuse protection with possession." Soren didn't answer. Some truths didn't need response. They never sat together. They never pretended the past hadn't happened. Sometimes they talked about logistics. Sometimes about nothing at all. Sometimes they just existed in the same space, careful not to take up more than they were given. Love, Soren was learning, didn't have to be loud to be real, but it did have to be chosen. One evening, as the child slept in his crib, Soren stood alone in the dim living room, looking at the soft shadows on the wall. He thought about everything he'd lost. He thought about everything he'd kept. Safety had arrived too late to save his past, but not too late to protect his future. And if you're sitting with that feeling right now, the quiet ache of something almost right, something still unresolved, don't turn away from it. Because sometimes the hardest stories aren't about whether love exists. They're about whether it arrives in time.